NATO expansion explained why Russia drew a red line. In the chilling autumn of 2021, Moscow dropped a geopolitical bombshell, publishing 2 draft treaties that demanded nothing less than a legal promise: NATO, the world's most powerful military alliance, must cease its eastward expansion, once and for all. Just 4 months later, Russian tanks were rolling across the Ukrainian border, shattering decades of fragile peace in Europe. Was this devastating conflict truly the inevitable outcome of 3 decades of alliance encroachment, a slow-motion strategic squeeze that finally snapped? Or is that just the convenient narrative the Kremlin spins to justify its actions? Tonight, we're going to rewind the tape, wave by painstaking wave, and let the facts, and the deeply held perceptions, speak for themselves. Prepare to delve into a story far more intricate than simple headlines suggest. Hit the subscribe button now. Let's continue. Picture Europe in 1990, a continent brimming with an almost dizzying sense of hope and change. The Berlin Wall, that stark symbol of division, was nothing but rubble. The Soviet Union, though crumbling, was still very much a geopolitical entity, and NATO, the Western Defensive Pact, counted a modest 22 members. Fast forward to today, and that picture is dramatically different. The alliance has nearly doubled in size. Its sophisticated weaponry now sits, at its closest points, a mere 100 kilometers from St. Petersburg, Russia's historic second city. For the Kremlin, every new flag hoisted on its border isn't just a new member, it's an existential threat, a tightening noose. How on earth did we get here? And why does Moscow so vehemently insist it drew a red line decades ago, a boundary the West repeatedly ignored? Keep watching, because the answer, as you'll discover, is far messier, and perhaps more rational from certain perspectives, than either side is typically willing to admit. Section 1 to 1990, the deal that wasn't. The reunification of East and West Germany in 1990 was a moment of immense historical significance, a triumph for freedom, but for the Soviet Union, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The agreement meant that NATO, their long-standing adversary, would extend its defensive umbrella into what was formerly East Germany. During the delicate negotiations, Soviet leaders recalled a crucial assurance. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, they claim, vowed, "Not 1 inch eastward." It's a phrase that has echoed through the decades, a powerful symbol of perceived Western betrayal. Western archives do indeed confirm that the sentence was spoken, but the context is key. Baker's assurance specifically referred to NATO troops not moving into the territory of the former German Democratic Republic, East Germany, after reunification. Crucially, no formal treaty or legally binding document ever enshrined a broader commitment against future NATO expansion beyond Germany's borders. It was a verbal assurance, given in a specific context, and never formalized into international law. Yet, inside the Kremlin, this anecdote hardened into gospel. For them, it wasn't just a miscommunication, it was proof the West was a cheat, reneging on a fundamental understanding. By December 1991, the USSR itself dissolved, splintering into 15 newly independent states. This seismic event left a newly sovereign Russia feeling profoundly vulnerable, almost encircled by default, its vast empire suddenly gone. While there was no formal pledge broken regarding its post-Soviet borders, the seed of betrayal, fueled by that not 1 inch memory, was firmly planted. This moment wasn't just about territory, it was about pride, power, and a deep-seated fear of losing strategic depth, a concept that would become central to Russia's military doctrine. The idea of a buffer zone, a protective layer of friendly or neutral states, was ingrained in Russian strategic thinking, and with the Soviet Union's collapse, that buffer evaporated almost overnight. Section 2 to 1994, the partnership and the first whispers. Fast forward to 1994, and the geopolitical landscape was still shifting dramatically. US President Bill Clinton launched the Partnership for Peace, PFP, program, presented as an olive branch to Moscow. The idea was simple: foster military cooperation and dialogue with former Soviet bloc countries, including Russia itself, without extending the full, ironclad Article 5 security guarantees of NATO membership. It was meant to be a way to integrate these nations into a broader European security framework, offering a pathway for military modernization and interoperability, without directly challenging Russia's sensibilities. From the Western perspective, PFP was a pragmatic step, a way to build trust and prevent new divisions. But for many Russians, it felt like a smokescreen, a clever diplomatic maneuver designed to slowly draw their former allies into the Western orbit. Meanwhile, in the capitals of former Warsaw Pact nations, Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw, a very different word was being whispered, then spoken aloud: membership. These nations remembered the brutal suppression of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution and the 1968 Prague Spring by Soviet tanks. They understood, with a chilling clarity, that true security lay not in partnerships, but in the collective defense enshrined in NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack against one member is an attack against all. They wanted a seat inside the club, not just a cozy spot in the waiting room. They yearned for the unequivocal protection that only NATO could offer against any potential resurgence of Russian imperial ambitions. The internal debate within NATO was fierce. Some, like the United States, pushed for expansion, arguing it was essential to solidify democracy and stability across Central and Eastern Europe. Others, notably Germany and France, were more cautious, wary of provoking a newly fragile Russia. Despite these reservations, the aspirations of the former Soviet satellites proved too strong to ignore. In 1997, NATO extended formal invitations to the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland to begin accession talks, a moment that sent shockwaves through Moscow. Russian President Boris Yeltsin reacted with howls of protest, decrying the move as a betrayal of the post-Cold War spirit and a direct threat to Russia's security. This wasn't just a diplomatic spat, it was the first real red crayon being dragged across the map, clearly marking a boundary that Moscow felt should never be crossed. The geopolitical lines were being redrawn, and Russia felt increasingly on the wrong side. Section 3 to 1999, the first wave on March 12, 1999, the inevitable happened. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland formally raised the NATO flag, becoming the alliance's newest members. For these nations, it was a moment of profound liberation and security, a definitive break from their Soviet past. For Russia, it was a profound blow. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued stern warnings of a new confrontation, accusing NATO of undermining European security and violating the spirit of cooperation. Moscow saw it as a hostile act, a deliberate erosion of its traditional sphere of influence. Yet, NATO, at that moment, was riding high, emboldened by its recent intervention in Kosovo. The alliance had launched an air campaign against Yugoslavia to stop ethnic cleansing, a controversial but ultimately successful operation that showcased its military prowess and unity. Flush with this perceived success, NATO seemingly brushed aside Russia's protests, effectively pocketing the trio of new members. The official communiqué from NATO headquarters was bland, speaking of a Europe whole and free, a vision that pointedly excluded Russia's concerns. But inside the Kremlin, the lesson was far simpler, and far more chilling. Treaties, particularly those based on informal understandings, don't protect you. What truly protects you are robust military capabilities and, more importantly, geopolitical buffers. The loss of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic meant the strategic buffer that had historically shielded Russia from Western powers had shrunk considerably. This reinforced a deeply ingrained Russian belief that security depended on controlling its periphery, a belief that would continue to shape its foreign policy for decades to come. The message Moscow received was clear: the West would expand when it suited its interests, regardless of Russian objections. Section 4 to 2004, the Baltic shock. If the 1999 expansion was a warning shot, the 2004 wave was a full-blown geopolitical earthquake for Moscow. 7 countries entered the alliance at once, a massive enlargement that fundamentally altered Europe's security map. Among them were Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, but the true shock to Russia came with the accession of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These weren't just former Warsaw Pact members, they were former Soviet republics, nations that shared direct land borders with Russia. Suddenly, NATO's eastern flank extended deep into what Russia considered its historical backyard. Moscow watched with alarm as NATO fighters began patrolling the Baltic airspace, an operational area now just a 7-minute flight from St. Petersburg, a city steeped in Russian imperial history. This wasn't abstract geopolitics, it was a tangible military presence right on Russia's doorstep. Defense planners in Moscow frantically dusted off contingency maps, redrawing scenarios and recalibrating threat assessments. For the Russian public, a new, unsettling mantra began to circulate: encirclement. The narrative of a hostile alliance steadily closing in on Russia gained powerful traction. This was the single biggest enlargement in NATO history, and it profoundly shifted perceptions. From this moment on, every Western assurance that the alliance was not directed against Russia fell on deaf ears inside the General Staff. How could it not be directed against Russia, they reasoned, when its borders now directly abutted Russian territory, bringing advanced military capabilities ever closer? The historical memory of invasions from the West, from Napoleon to Hitler, combined with the perceived broken promises of the 1990s, created a potent cocktail of suspicion and resentment. For Moscow, 2004 wasn't just an expansion, it was an undeniable, deeply threatening strategic realignment. Section 5 to 2008, the Bucharest fuse. The year 2008 brought another critical juncture, and perhaps the most direct provocation in Russia's eyes. At the NATO summit in Bucharest, a seismic decision was made. The alliance formally promised Ukraine and Georgia that they will become members. This wasn't an immediate invitation, but it was a clear declaration of intent, an open-door policy extended to two nations that Russia considered absolutely vital to its own security and historical identity. US President George W. Bush was a strong advocate for immediate action, pushing for both countries to receive a Membership Action Plan, MAP, the formal step towards accession. However, powerful European allies, particularly Germany and France, balked. They were deeply concerned that such a move would be a dangerous step too far, directly provoking Russia and potentially destabilizing the entire region. The alliance, unable to reach a full consensus, split the difference: no immediate map, but a clear, albeit verbal, pledge of future membership. This compromise, intended to bridge the divide, arguably created the worst of both worlds, offering a promise without immediate protection, thereby infuriating Russia without fully securing Ukraine and Georgia. Vladimir Putin, who was, remarkably, invited to the final dinner of the summit, delivered a chilling warning. He stated unequivocally that Russia would respond harshly if NATO continued its eastward march into these critical territories. He saw the pledge as a direct assault on Russia's core security interests, an unacceptable encroachment on its strategic buffer. The implications were clear, and terrifyingly, they materialized just 4 months later. In August 2008, Russian tanks rolled into Georgia, ostensibly to protect separatist regions. The Red Line, once merely a rhetorical boundary, had become kinetic, erupting in a violent regional conflict. For Moscow, this was a preemptive strike, a clear message that its warnings were not idle threats. For the West, it was an act of blatant aggression, a violation of international law. But the seeds of that aggression, from Russia's perspective, were sown in Bucharest. Section 6 to 2014, Ukraine tilts. The geopolitical tremors continued, leading to a profound shift in 2014. Kyiv's Maidan Revolution, a popular uprising driven by a desire for closer ties with Europe and against government corruption, toppled a Moscow-friendly president, Viktor Yanukovych. The new provisional government in Ukraine, reflecting the will of the protesters, immediately signaled its intention to pursue a pro-Western course, including making NATO membership a strategic goal. This was, for Moscow, an unacceptable crossing of every red line imaginable. Russia reacted swiftly and brutally. First, it annexed Crimea, a strategically vital peninsula with a majority Russian-speaking population and home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, following a highly controversial referendum. Then, it ignited a proxy war in eastern Ukraine, supporting separatists in the Donbas region, transforming a political crisis into a devastating armed conflict. For Western capitals, these actions were clear, unprovoked acts of aggression, a flagrant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and international law. But from Moscow's vantage point, these were preemptive measures, a necessary defense against the very Bucharest pledge it had feared and warned against. The Kremlin saw the Maidan Revolution not as a spontaneous popular uprising, but as a Western-orchestrated coup, designed to bring Ukraine irrevocably into the NATO sphere. The fear was that if Ukraine joined NATO, the alliance's military infrastructure, including potentially missile systems, could be deployed hundreds of miles closer to Russia's heartland, fundamentally altering the strategic balance. For the first time, the abstract debate about NATO expansion left the quiet conference rooms of Brussels and Washington and became a brutal reality, fought with artillery shells and human lives on the plains of eastern Ukraine. The Red Line had now cost thousands of lives. Section 7, 2016-2020, Montenegro and North Macedonia. Even after the seismic events of 2014, NATO's open-door policy remained firmly in place, leading to two further, albeit smaller, expansions. In 2017, Montenegro, a tiny Balkan nation, joined the alliance, followed by North Macedonia in 2020. On the map, these are small additions, easily overlooked. But in terms of messaging and symbolism, they were huge. For Russia, these accessions, no matter how small the countries, were yet more evidence that NATO would not, and perhaps could not, stop its eastward creep. Moscow viewed each new member as a further erosion of its geopolitical influence and a continued demonstration of Western disregard for its security concerns. In both cases, the Kremlin tried desperately to keep them out, employing a range of tactics from overt diplomatic pressure to covert actions. In Montenegro, Russian intelligence was implicated in an alleged coup attempt in 2016 aimed at disrupting the country's pro-Western trajectory. Similar disinformation campaigns and political interference were reported in North Macedonia. Despite these efforts, both nations successfully joined the alliance. For Moscow, every single accession, no matter how geographically minor, served as a stark, undeniable proof point: NATO would not stop. It solidified the narrative that the alliance was inherently expansionist and determined to encircle Russia, regardless of the consequences. These smaller expansions, therefore, reinforced the Kremlin's deep-seated paranoia and contributed to its growing sense of strategic vulnerability. Section 8 to 2022, the invasion logic. The culmination of these decades of tension, perceived betrayals, and escalating rhetoric arrived in February 2022. Days before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin published a lengthy essay, a chilling manifesto denying Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation and accusing the West of using it as a pawn against Russia. Central to his justification for war was the explicit fear of NATO expansion, specifically citing the threat of NATO missiles that could appear in Kharkiv, a major Ukrainian city just miles from the Russian border. The argument was clear: Russia was acting defensively, preemptively. Days later, the invasion began. Western leaders universally condemned it as an unprovoked act of aggression, a brutal violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. They pointed to Russia's long history of destabilizing its neighbors and its imperial ambitions. But on Russian state television, a very different narrative played out. The invasion was portrayed as the long-promised pushback, the inevitable, righteous response to 30 years of relentless NATO creep towards Russia's borders. It was framed as a defensive war, a necessary measure to protect Russia from an encroaching, hostile alliance. Whatever the true primary motive, whether it was imperial ambition, a desire to restore a lost empire, or genuine security fears, the war made one thing absolutely certain: the geopolitical calculus of Europe changed overnight. Finland and Sweden, two historically neutral nations, abandoned their long-standing non-alignment policies almost instantly. The invasion, rather than deterring NATO, galvanized it and ironically triggered the very expansion Russia claimed it was trying to prevent. The fear of an aggressive, unpredictable Russia on their doorstep proved far more potent than any perceived risk of provoking Moscow. Section 9 to 2023-24, the Nordic aftershock. The immediate fallout from Russia's 2022 invasion was swift and dramatic. In April 2023, Finland formally joined NATO. This single act instantly doubled the alliance's direct frontier with Russia, adding a formidable 1,340-kilometer border that was previously neutral. This wasn't just any border, it was a strategically significant one, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic. For NATO, it dramatically enhanced its northern flank and Arctic capabilities. For Russia, it represented a monumental strategic setback, bringing the alliance even closer to its vital Kola Peninsula, home to its northern fleet. Sweden, Finland's Nordic neighbor, quickly followed suit, with its accession formalized in early 2024. For decades, both nations had carefully maintained their neutrality, believing it offered the best protection against Russian aggression. But the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine shattered that illusion. The threat of an expansionist Russia proved to be a far greater concern than the risk of joining a military alliance. Moscow, predictably, reacted with threats, including warnings of potential nuclear deployments in Belarus and increased military presence near the new NATO borders. However, these threats failed to deter either Helsinki or Stockholm. Why? Because for Finland and Sweden, the deterrent they sought from NATO, the ironclad protection of Article 5 against Russian aggression, now overwhelmingly outweighed the risk of further provoking Russia by joining. The cost-benefit analysis had fundamentally shifted. The red line Russia had hoped to enforce through invasion had, ironically, only accelerated the very expansion it sought to prevent, creating an even more formidable NATO presence on its borders. Section 10, Why Russia Sees a Red Line. So, why does Russia, despite Western assurances and the voluntary nature of NATO membership, consistently perceive NATO expansion as a dire, existential threat, a red line repeatedly crossed? It boils down to a complex interplay of factors. 1. Geography. This is perhaps the most straightforward. Every wave of NATO expansion has moved the alliance's military infrastructure, including potential strike assets, closer to Russia's vital centers. From Moscow's perspective, this reduces warning times, increases vulnerability, and necessitates a constant, costly military response. The closer NATO gets, the less strategic depth Russia has, and the more exposed it feels. 2. History. Russia's historical narrative is deeply shaped by invasions from the West. The memory of the Napoleonic Wars, both World Wars, and the Cold War confrontation is ever present. The collapse of the Soviet Union represented not just a lost empire but a profound national humiliation, a perceived broken word from the West regarding not 1 inch. This historical trauma, combined with the feeling of betrayal, fuels a deep-seated suspicion and a determination to never again be seen as weak or vulnerable. 3. Domestic politics. For the Kremlin, particularly under Vladimir Putin, the narrative of an external enemy, a hostile, encroaching NATO, serves a crucial domestic purpose. It justifies increased military spending, deflects attention from internal problems, and allows the leadership to consolidate power by rallying the populace around a common threat. The siege mentality fostered by this narrative helps legitimize authoritarian control and suppress dissent, painting any opposition as being aligned with external adversaries. 4. Military doctrine. Russian military doctrine places an immense premium on strategic depth. This concept refers to the geographical distance between a nation's core territories and its borders, providing space for maneuver, defense in depth, and the ability to absorb an initial attack. NATO's expansion, particularly into former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact nations, has, from Russia's perspective, eaten away at this strategic depth meter by meter, leaving Russia feeling exposed and vulnerable to a quick strike. Western analysts, of course, offer a counter-narrative. They rightly point out that every new member asked to join NATO, driven by their own sovereign choices and often by a genuine fear of Russian resurgence. They argue that Russia's real fear isn't tanks or missiles, but democracy on its doorstep, the contagion of successful, prosperous, democratic states bordering an autocratic Russia, which could inspire similar aspirations within its own population. Ultimately, both narratives contain elements of truth. Neither fully justifies Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, an act of aggression that violated international law and caused immense suffering. Yet, understanding these deeply entrenched perspectives helps to explain why Russia drew its red line in crimson ink, and why the world's most powerful military alliance keeps bumping up against the Kremlin's oldest, most profound insecurities. Call to action. If this breakdown helped you see the geopolitical chessboard with a bit more clarity, hit that subscribe button for more history without the noise, and be sure to check out the playlist linked below for our deep dive into what Article 5 actually obliges countries to do. See you in the next video. Conclusion. From a reunified East Germany in 1990 to Finland and Sweden in 2023 and 2024, NATO has undergone a remarkable transformation, growing from 16 to 32 members. Russia didn't draw its red line in a single, unambiguous treaty clause, rather, it was etched, wave by painful wave, in a gradual accretion of new flags appearing on the map. Each new star, each new member, served as a potent, constant reminder to Moscow of the Soviet collapse, of a lost empire, and of a diminished sphere of influence. For the newcomers, joining NATO was a voluntary act, a sovereign choice for security and stability. Yet, in the Russian memory, this expansion was viewed as nothing less than an existential threat, a deliberate encroachment on its vital interests. Understanding that profound paradox, the voluntary aspirations of nations versus the existential fears of a former superpower, doesn't, for a moment, justify war. But it profoundly explains why the world's most powerful military alliance continues to collide with the Kremlin's deepest, most enduring insecurities.